Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Weekend Bible Study. In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house, and the elders of Judah were sitting before me. Ezekiel 8, beginning in verse 1. The hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there. I looked, and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire, and from there up his appearance was bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. This is stuff to make your hair stand on end. You almost need the special effects people to try to give you some idea, because he didn't say that he just reached out his hand and took me. He put out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in a vision of God he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. What on earth might that be? It harkens back to Daniel's abomination of desolation, Jesus making the remark about the abomination of desolation. We know that people like Antiochus Epiphanes and then the Romans later on did things to deliberately desecrate the temple. But here there was an idol posted right at the north gate of the inner court of the temple. It's a shocking thing to consider, but pagan symbolism had penetrated the holiness of the temple, and this time it wasn't because of some outsider that had brought it in and imposed it upon them. Babylonians didn't make them do that. They did it themselves. It may be shocking to us, but I tell you, it is inevitable. You would think that people would separate their religion and their practices. They would say, okay, they worship Yahweh in that temple. We'll build our own house of worship over here, and it will be an alternative to the house of Yahweh. You know, it's really strange, but in almost every avenue of human endeavor, that doesn't happen. The reason is that the true worship of the true God stands as a condemnation for what they're doing, and they have to try to take that over as well. They just can't stand it. It is really strange, and people cannot leave you alone to go ahead and worship God the way you want to, do what you want to do, make a mess of your life if you must. They got to tell you how to do it and how to live. There's an analogy on this, interestingly enough, in gay marriage, and that big issue. Not content to allow marriage to exist as it always has, they have to invade it. One of the most shocking and yet revealing instances of this occurred in the Miss USA pageant this year. Now, I am at a dead loss to know why on earth they would ask a gay man to judge a beauty contest. But that's the world we live in. But this guy was so threatened, even repulsed, I think, by beauty, that he had to ask this woman the question, what do you think about gay marriage? And she didn't attack gay marriage, basically just expressed her opinion about the matter. He couldn't be content with that, and his subsequent actions suggest that the man hated her for her answer, which was, well, my upbringing and everything I've always believed, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, which is, of course, what most Americans believe. But here she was, on the spot. I really don't know if the gay community realized to this moment how much damage they have done to their own cause by the way they have handled this simple, innocent, little incident in a beauty contest. But it has to do with, I think in some cases, a hatred of beauty. Well, anyway, Ezekiel finds himself in the temple with an idol sitting over there, and before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain. The same as the one he saw before. He described it in chapter 1. He said, Son of man, look toward the north. So I looked, and in the entrance of the north of the gate of the altar, I saw this idol of jealousy. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utterly detestable things the house of Israel is doing here, things that will drive me far away from my sanctuary. but you're going to see things that are even more detestable. Then this really ought to make our blood run cold. God speaking of I'm sorry, if this is the way you people are going to do things, I'm leaving. And I'm going to leave you to your own devices, and I'm going to let the fruit of your own ways come down on your head. I won't have to sit at my console and press this button or that button to cause you problems. You're going into disaster. I'm just going to go away and let it happen. Then he brought me to the entrance to the court, and I looked and I saw a hole in the wall. He said, "Son of man, dig into the wall." So I did, and I found a doorway. And he said, "Go in and see the wicked and detestable things they are doing here." So I went in and looked, and I saw portrayed on the walls all kinds of crawling things and detestable animals and all the idols of the house of Israel. You know, I really wondered at that because I remember a visit I made to Pompeii once upon a time, years ago, and they had restored and excavated and shown you some of the ways in which the people in those areas had gone, the things they had done, and the erotic art that was on the walls of their houses. And what you got to also understand is that an awful lot of the religion of these pagan gods was erotic in nature. And I can only imagine what kind of things they put on the walls in there. And this is right as a part of the temple of God. House of Israel, by the way, here is probably all-inclusive for the north. The northern tribes had gone the same way in their worship and had gone into captivity. Now they are just dealing with Judah. Now in front of these idols stood 70 elders of the house of Israel, and Jaazaniah the son of Shaphan was standing among them. Every one of them had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was rising. He said to me, "Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? They say, 'God doesn't see what we're doing. He's forsaken the land. He's not here. He doesn't know.' But he does know." And this is really, you have to think this through. And I don't want to call upon your imagination to do nasty work, but you've got to realize God is not looking at this thing and say, all these men are doing, they're just standing there, they got a censer in their hand, they're just waving a censer around like you've seen sometimes on television. And that's all they're doing. They're just doing it to a false god, and this is making God furious. He's calling it detestable. He's saying all these bad things about him. What it winds up doing, if you're not careful, it makes God look petty, and that's the way the world likes to look at him. But these things that were going on here were not petty. They were evil. They had to do with the destruction of, with the other absolute destruction and the abuse of children. They had to do with sexual practices that are abominable to us and to most people. And the 70 elders means essentially the entire religious establishment at Jerusalem was going down this road. Again, he said, verse 13, "You will see them doing things that are even more detestable." And he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there mourning for Tammuz. According to pagan religion, Tammuz was betrayed by his lover Ishtar, and as a result, he dies every autumn. The wilting of the vegetation at that time of year is seen as a sign of his death, and this caused great mourning in the ancient world. And that's why the women in Jerusalem wept. He said to me, "Do you see this, son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this." He brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and there at the entrance to the temple, between the portico and the altar, there were about 25 men. With their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, they were bowing down to the sun in the east. I never did feel comfortable about those Easter sunrise services, even back when I did it. I sort of attributed my discomfort to the fact that I didn't like to get up that early, but that's another matter. I just never did feel right about a sunrise service. He said to me, "Have you seen this, son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the house of Judah to do the detestable things they are doing here? Do they have to also fill the land with violence and continually provoke me to anger? Look at them, sticking the branch to their nose. Nobody really knows for sure. There's all sorts of speculation you'll find, but there's no agreement about what it means. Therefore I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them. Though they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them. I have an idea that Ezekiel knew what all these verbal icons like the branch to the nose really meant. But you know, the Bible is a family book. It's racy enough in places, but it's given to us to tell us what was going on without getting down into the dirt with the people who are doing the dirt. And God just basically gives them these verbal icons so that they know what he's talking about, and you may have to use your imagination to be sure you understand what he's talking about. He says, I'm fed up with this. I'm not going to look upon them with pity. I am not going to spare them. They can shout in my ears, and I'm just not going to listen to them anymore. One of the things that's interesting about this is that the end of it all seems to be violence. And one wonders how bad it could be, how bad it could become if God did not intervene. Looking at our society, I don't know where we are in this cycle. We've been through cycles before. One a lot like this one came in 1929 and sent us into the most destructive war in history. We could be in a chastisement phase again in which people turn back to God. And we could end up in a war again with a terrible loss of life, which might end up to people turning back to God. And we could end up in the last war of all. Revelation 14, verse 12, kind of applies. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord henceforth. This is an echo of Isaiah 57, verse 1. The righteous perish, and no one ponders it in his heart. Devout men are taken away, and no one understands that the righteous are taken away to be spared from evil. Those who walk uprightly enter into peace. They find rest as they lie in death. There's a program in the current cycle of programs going out to radio stations. You'd want to catch this one. It is titled, I think, When the Righteous Perish. That's chapter 8, and we'll go on with chapter 9. Ezekiel is continuing to describe the vision that began in chapter 8. He cried also in my ears with a loud voice, saying, Cause them that have charge over the city to draw near, even every man with his destroying weapon in his hand. And behold, 6 men came from the way of the higher gate, which lies toward the north, and every man had a slaughter weapon in his hand, I guess axes and swords. And one man among them was clothed with linen, and had a writer's inkhorn by his side, and they went in and stood beside the brazen altar. Now I don't think for a moment that these are merely men. That's just the way they happen to appear to Ezekiel. This chap with the writer's inkhorn, this one starts to scare me just a little bit. He said, The glory of the Lord of Israel was gone up from the cherub whereupon he was to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed with linen, who had the writer's inkhorn by his side. And he said, I want you to go through this city, through the middle of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that are done in the middle of it. Now I read that, and I have to ask myself, are you comfortable with this society? Are you all cozied up to it? Can you watch all the entertainment that's coming your way from time to time in the movies and on television and so forth? Does it bother you at all? And how would this attitude of sighing and crying for all the abominations be reflected in what you actually do day by day? Well, this guy is sent through to mark those people who really hated the evil that was going on in their society at that time. Then he said to the others within my hearing, follow him through the city and smite. Don't let your eyes spare. Don't have pity. Slay utterly old and young, maids and little children and women. Just don't come near any man upon whom is the mark, and start at my sanctuary. Then they began at the ancient men that were before the house. Where are they starting? They're starting with the leadership, folks. They're starting with the people who should have stood in the gap, the people who were positioned to lead the people in a different direction. And it ought to become sobering to anybody who reads this sort of thing and think, wait a minute, my children, are they going to be vulnerable because of the way I'm living my life? If they put a mark on me, I want it on my children, on my wife, my family. Well, lead, friend, because it is that leadership that can spare your own kids. Now, what you are seeing here is a vision, not reality yet. And every little icon or verbal icon that we find in here, from the 6 men and a seventh, from the writer's inkhorn to the instruments of slaughter, to the sparing of some and the killing of others, all this stuff is symbolic. It's intended to convey meaning to us. So don't sit around worrying about details. Look for the meaning. And in this case, look at where they start, at the oldest men, the elders, if you will, in the forefront. And consider how bad things must have become for this to be the action following. He said to them, defile the house, fill the courts with the slain, go forth. And they went forth, and they slew in the city. And it came to pass, while they were slaying them, that I was left, and I fell on my face, and I said, Lord God, will you destroy all the residue of Israel in pouring out your fury upon Jerusalem? Then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceeding great. The land is full of blood. The city is full of perverseness. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the earth, and the Lord doesn't see. What on earth makes us think we can do things in the dark and God won't know? What is it that makes us think we can do things behind closed doors and God won't see? That he doesn't record, that he isn't aware? And how long can we go and think that we can do this, we can do these things, and there never be karma coming down on our heads, if you want to choose the word? It's funny that even the ancient Eastern religions know that actions have consequences and that there is a kind of karma that comes down on people. And in the Bible, it really is presented to us as our own ways coming down around our own ears. As for me also, my eye will not spare. I will not have pity. I will recompense their way upon their head. And behold, a man clothed with linen, which had the inkhorn by his side, reported the matter, saying, I have done what you told me to do. I don't know what Ezekiel saw. I gather he didn't see very many people who had that mark. The vision continues in chapter 10. When I read these things, I feel like I've awakened from a terrible nightmare. And I try to get back to a sense of reality in the world in which I live. The message that is coming through to me is this: you had better separate yourself from the evil things that people are doing in this world. You'd better get your life clean and right before God. And it isn't just a question of incense and burning and this, that. It isn't a question of trivia. It's the big things. And you better be one upon whom God places a mark to protect you in the times that are coming ahead. That's the message I'm reading. Chapter 10. Ezekiel said, I looked, and I saw the likeness of a throne of sapphire above the expanse that was over the heads of the cherubim. And the Lord said to the man clothed in linen, the one with the writer's inkhorn, Go in among the wheels beneath the cherubim. Fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city. As I watched, he went in. Now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple when the man went in, and a cloud filled the inner court. Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim, moved to the threshold of the temple, and the cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of God. Even the special effects people are going to be stumped by this to know what it looked like. No one had ever seen anything like this before. And what Ezekiel is doing is just telling us the best way he knew how what he was seeing. The sound of the wings of the cherubim could be heard as far away as the outer court, like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. When the Lord commanded the man in linen, "Take fire from among the wheels, from among the cherubim," he went in and stood beside a wheel. Then one of the cherubim reached out his hand to the fire. He took up some of it and put it into the hands of the man in linen, who took it and went out. Together, these aren't human beings. These aren't men, for hands would be burning as a result of it, falling off with fire. They're angelic. Under the wings of the cherubim, I could see what looked like the hands of a man. I looked, and I saw beside the cherubim 4 wheels, one on each side of the cherubim. The wheels sparkled like chrysolite. As for their appearance, the 4 of them looked alike. Each was like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the cherubim faced. The wheels did not turn about as the cherubim went. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced without turning as they went. This is really a strange thing. But again, you have to remember, this is an icon. This is symbolic. And you've got these great spirit beings, almost like the chariots of God, and they either go in the direction of this face or that face. They go in straight lines, and when they stop, they can turn and go at right angles. They don't go curving anywhere. Everything is as straight as a die. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were the 4 wheels. I heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels. I have no idea. However, it does call to mind a peacock with those little eyes all up and down there. That's the way you would kind of describe it. And I guess it was something like that. Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. One was that of a cherub, second the face of a man, the third the face of a lion, and the 4th the face of an eagle. All these mean something. Then the cherubim rose upward. These were the living creatures I had seen by the Kibar River. Reflecting back to chapter 1. When the cherubim moved, the wheels beside them moved. When the cherubim spread their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels did not leave their side. They all went up. When the cherubim stood still, they also stood still. When the cherubim arose, they rose with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in them. That's the best Ezekiel can tell us about what he's seeing in this case. Everything moved together because they were directed by the same thing. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance to the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. These were the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel by the Kibar River, and I realized they were cherubim. Each had 4 faces and 4 wings, and under their wings was what looked like the hands of a man. Their faces had the same appearance as those I had seen by the Kibar River. Each one went straight ahead. I wish I could explain to you exactly what the significance of all this is. I'm just awed by the fact that here's a man who got to see, in vision, not in person, what things were like when God's, what shall we call it, his portable throne, his chariot that he uses to go from place to place, or the way in which he moves from place to place. Why no curved path? I don't know. This appears to be something that no man had ever seen before, and Ezekiel did his best to describe it. It seems to be the chariot of Jehovah. We'll have to wait until God makes that a little clearer some other time. For now, we've got questions. Doug Young writes again from San Diego. He says, I feel kind of stupid for asking this question, but I've never heard it explained. What does Ezekiel mean when he says, the word of the Lord came to me? Did he hear an actual voice? Was it a voice in his head? Was it a real person standing before him? Just what was it that came to Ezekiel and the other prophets as well? Well, Ezekiel never explains, and neither does anyone else. But the wording in the light of the first chapter of John is suggestive of the one called the Word who actually came to him and spoke in his hearing. This is the Word who became flesh and dwelt among us. Otherwise, we have just a voice in the head. I think this has to be more than that. Even the context suggests a personal messenger. Those men in the Old Testament who encountered God in one way or another were rarely cognizant of the identities of the heavenly messenger. There are two different manifestations, at least two to consider. One is the expression, the word of the Lord, which we're talking about. The word dabar, translated Lord, actually seems to mean a spokesman. The other is the angel of the Lord. In Hebrew, it's the Malach Yehovah. Everyone knows by now the Hebrew name for God is Yahweh in English. It's Jehovah. Jim Tabor suggested this is not the Malach of Jehovah, but the Malach Yehovah, in other words, the messenger who is Jehovah. Now, I get no sense from the Old Testament that the men of God had any idea of a father behind the God they encountered in their actions. As for me, I think the word of Jehovah is a person, not merely words spoken into the air which were heard by Ezekiel, but I can't prove that. I'm not the only one who thinks that the Malach Yehovah is the one we know as Jesus Christ. Malach is translated angel, but that is misleading in both testaments. The word in Hebrew and in Greek is not angel, it's messenger. And there are several kinds of messengers in the Bible defined by context. Defined as actors, they are often called men, because that's exactly what they looked like to Abraham and to the other people who encountered them. Bonnie Eversole writes again, yes, some of us are still tuned in. It's my plan to continue to tune in to Weekend Bible Study as long as you continue to teach the Scriptures, one book at a time, as long as I can follow the message in my King James Version. I've heard many sermons containing verses quoted from the book of Ezekiel. You are the only teacher or preacher I've ever heard teach the Bible one book at a time. I practice listening to your tape on Friday night, on the Sabbath. I drag out a modern translation of the Bible, read the given chapter, exchange that translation for my old King James Version, and try to follow along as you read. She said, the version you read differs from both my versions. I'd better explain. What I normally do is I work with the King James Version, but out of long habit, because some of the expressions like wouldst and couldst and so forth are hard to say, I basically paraphrase the King James Version as I go. That's why it doesn't look like what you're reading there. But when I decide to really go another direction, and I feel like I really need to, I shift to the NIV. So don't worry about my being discouraged from what I'm doing. I'm going to keep on doing it. Teaching the Bible one book at a time is my favorite method ever since college years. So, as I say, you'll hear the King James Version paraphrased. Then you will hear the NIV, and once in a while I'll go off into the NASB or the New Revised Standard Version. If I do that, I most likely will tell you. Now from Lake Worth, Florida, Edie Worthington writes about 2 Kings 24:12. Could the 3 months, 8 years reign be 3 months for Jehoiakim during the 8th year of King Nebuchadnezzar? For those of you tuning in late, the question arises from 2 Kings 24, verse 8. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. Then in verse 12 it says, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers, And the king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign. I can easily see why someone would take this as the 8th year of Jehoiakim, but then they're puzzled by the fact that it says he only reigned 3 months. So I think Edie's probably correct. I have not thoroughly researched this one, but her suggestion is 3 months for Jehoiakim, and it happened during the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar. This is the sort of thing that used to drive the students around the bend. In my Old Testament survey class, I always required their term paper always had to be a chronology that they had done as a result of their reading of the Old Testament, whereby they recorded every single chronological instance they came to in their reading and charted it out for themselves and, of course, for me as a teacher. Do I need to tell you that no two of them were ever the same? Diane writes from Blythe, California. I have a question that has nothing to do with our Bible studies. I enjoy them very much. This question is on being called. If a person is called into this way of life, what happens if you are not chosen? What does it mean to be not chosen? Well, now she's referring to the scriptures. One of them's in Matthew 20, the other's in Matthew 22. Here, the best way to answer this question is look at the context. We'll do Matthew 22, verse 1. Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who made a marriage for his son. He sent his servants to call them that were invited to the wedding, and they wouldn't come. Again he sent other servants, saying, Tell them that are bidden, I've prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fatlings are killed, all things are ready, come. They made light of it. They went their way, one to his farm, another to his merchandise, and the remnant took his servants and treated them spitefully and killed them. When the king heard of it, he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city, which I think is a reference to what is going to happen to Jerusalem because of what they do to Jesus and what they have done in between those times. He said, The wedding is ready, but they that were bidden were not worthy. So go into the highways, and as many as you shall find, invite to the marriage. So they went out in the highways, gathered together as many as they found, both good and bad. And the wedding was furnished with guests. And when the king came in to see the guests, he saw there a man that had not on a wedding garment. And he said, Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. So he said, Tie him up, throw him out in the dark. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. Now, if you go back, and I can understand why this puzzles some people, but if you go back and you read this in context, it's not that hard to understand. These people were invited and refused to go. And the many are called, but few are chosen, has to do with the fact that a response is required from us. We got to RSVP on this thing, and we got to say, yes, I will be there. So the invitation of God goes out to many, but not very many people choose to respond to it. It seems to me that what's required is the calling of God on the one hand, and a response from us on the other hand. It is that failure to respond means we are not chosen, when all we had to do was show up. Well, a little more than that. We also had to dress properly and show up. In other words, a proper response is required from us, and a respectful one at that. Diane says, if you will, please help. I may not be the only one who's thought of this, and I wondered about the meaning. No, you are far from the only one who's wondered about that. That's troubled an awful lot of people down through time. Got one that came in just this morning from Mark and Deborah of Crystal Lake, Illinois. We are listening with great interest to your study of Ezekiel. Don't have any questions about Ezekiel. The word is sobering. My wife has a question or two about the economy. She wants to know, what would God's economy be like? Well, by coincidence, we have a program in the cycle right now. I think it may even be up on the radio archives, but you should have no difficulty in locating it. Just do a little search for it. It's about biblical economics, and it does tell you precisely what the economy of God would be like. And what about this stock market thing? We have heard before that investing in the stock market is not good for Christians because it is gambling, and gambling is a sin. Well, No, it's not. There's a way of investing in the stock market that is like gambling. But frankly, what you're doing when you invest in the stock market is you decide, I like this company. It looks to me like we're going to need steel in our market for an awful long time. Of the steel companies, U.S. Steel appears to me to be the best one out there. So I am going to purchase a share of U.S. Steel. You have become a company owner, not a gambler. But I'm afraid the way many people go investing in the stock market, when they don't know what they are doing, then they may well be gambling. But the penalty for gambling is you lose your money. My question is, if no one invested in the stock market, how would business operate? Well, it wouldn't. And there's not a thing in the world wrong with 4 or 5 of us getting together and saying, you say you want to start this new business of yours and you say you can't afford it. I'll tell you what, me and my 4 friends here, we're going to put up the money you need to get this thing going. Call it venture capital. And for our part in doing this, we're going to own a share of your company. This is not usury. This is not wrong. There is nothing biblically that would tell you you can't do that sort of thing. Now, he went on to say, I'm not an expert about it. Well, neither am I. So be sure if you're going to invest in the stock market, inform yourself. That's the Bible study for today. I have no more questions. Send your comments to me, ron@borntowin.net.